Um, One could go on for quite a long time introducing Phil, and because he's had a really extraordinary career. As many of you know, I like to quote President Johnson in talking about what his objectives were for the LBJ School when he talked about trying to prepare a generation of thinkers and doers. And if there's anybody who ever deserved that moniker, it's Phil, who's had an extraordinary career as a writer, as a teacher, as a thinker, but also as a practitioner. And the great strength of his work has been his ability to excel in every one of those dimensions. I think you all know of his service in both the first and the second Bush administration. In addition, he's had a distinguished academic career at Harvard and the University of Virginia. He's led important national efforts to deal with big national questions, including election law reform and the 9/11 Commission. He's had, as I say, an extraordinary record of producing his own scholarship, including an important book on German unification. And he's also a Texan. So he brings many, many great virtues here. He's a lawyer by training, which is another not insignificant credential, and had a very distinguished early career doing that and working on some important litigation that he and I had a chance to share thoughts about. One thing that I've known Phil in a variety of these capacities over the years, but one of the things I most enjoyed was our association on the Aspen Strategy Group, where Phil played a very important role. And so I have here, in honor of our association, just a token of memories, that as we go forward, there's an Aspen Strategy Group tradition that you're allowed a certain amount of time to talk, and you have a green paddle. But when your time expires, you get a red paddle, and that means it's the time for you to talk. Phil, we are so eager about hearing you today that I'm going to put away the red paddle, put it under my desk. You have a permanent green paddle to continue to give this talk on global civilization, which I think is going to be an extraordinarily stimulating look at some of the big challenges and ways of thinking about U.S. foreign policy and the U.S. role in the world in the coming years. So, Dr. Zelikow.
Thanks very much. Can folks hear me in the back? All right. I think it's easier if I stand up. And I was thinking about what topic to choose for the talk today. And the standard way you do this is you pick some topic in current events on which you think you perhaps know a little bit extra. And you talk about that topic and try to enrich everybody's understanding of something they're reading about in the newspapers every day. And that's very helpful. That's not what I'm going to be doing today. Instead, what I wanted to do is share with you some work that I've been doing as part of an ongoing project that I find very difficult but very important. After I left government last year, I was doing some work with an outfit out of Washington called the Bipartisan Policy Center. It's organized under the auspices of four former Senate Majority Leaders, George Mitchell, Tom Daschle, Bob Dole, and Howard Baker. And their goal was to try to find some way of developing ideas that would cross party lines and might offer some broader guidance for America in the future. They've been getting a group of people together to think about some way of thinking about foreign policy that'll cross the partisan divide, because it was their observation that the most enduring and effective concepts in American foreign policy historically have been those that crossed party lines and that endured despite the oscillations of the American electoral cycle. And so I got involved with that group. They asked me to look at that and see if I could come up with any sort of big ideas. And so what I'll share with you is a work in progress. And share with you some of the challenges that I was thinking about working through to try to develop some ideas about global civilization or a law-abiding world. Now, when I accepted this challenge, frankly, the first thing I began thinking about was not current events, but I began thinking historically, because the problem of how to define common international purposes for a modern world is not new. In fact, I think the most productive intellectual ferment about these issues probably occurred between 1890 and 1950. During the late 19th century, there were swirling, fundamental debates about nationalism, imperialism, capitalism, socialism, anarchism, populism, progressivism, pacifism, and more. Industries, technologies, breakthroughs in chemistry, transportation, communications, new forms of commerce were rapidly transforming the shape of the world. global empires extending their reach with astonishing ease, huge movements of populations. Everywhere, traditional beliefs and ways of life were battered and eroding. I was very struck in reflecting on this period and the ideas people came up with back then, around the turn of the century, with the observations of one of the most thoughtful and literate men of that age, Henry Adams. Henry Adams, a renowned man of letters. His father, grandfather, and great-grandfather had all lived at the pinnacle of American politics. His great-grandfather is now the subject of an HBO miniseries. Adams himself had become a somewhat dyspeptic intellectual by the year 1900 when he visited the Paris Exposition of that year, the Paris Exposition of 1900, which was a proud exhibit of all the wonders of the new modern age. One of those wonders, which was rapidly coming into use during the 1890s, was electricity. So Adams had this experience in which he walked up to one of these new electrical dynamos, 40 feet high. I want you to imagine the picture. This balding, bearded man in his dapper suit, standing silently, gazing upward, inches away from this 40-foot machine, whirring silently and generating vast power. In its way, Adams thought, the dynamo was a perfect symbol for the impersonal forces animating his age. In his imagination, he contrasted the dynamo with the greatest expressions of human force in more traditional ages of man. In his imagination, he thought, what would have been the equivalent of the dynamo as an expression of human force in traditional life? And the great metaphorical example he came up with was the magnificent medieval cathedral of Chartres. That cathedral represented the finest achievement of traditional life, in that case 13th century life. Adams actually wrote about the fantastic variety and detail of statuary, the extraordinary artistry of its glass, the sheer scale of the thing, which in the 13th century fantastically dwarfed anything within hundreds of miles in any direction. The dynamo, of course, reflects one kind of power. The cathedral, too, is an expression of vast forces that had to come together in that age to create it. The forces that produced that vast work, the forces it expressed, were those of faith. In that case, faith above all in the Virgin. Adams then wrote about the metaphorical contrast of, quote, the dynamo and the Virgin in a pair of books, one Mont Saint-Michel in Chartres, and its sequel, The Education of Henry Adams. In those books, he introduced two fundamental themes. One is the struggle for a unity of belief. You see, the magnificence of Chartres was a monument of hope. Hope for a civitas Dei, a community of God, a hope that had reached a kind of peak in the 13th century. The hope for a spiritual unity of people, in this case the unity of Christendom, that would strive with a common faith to realize common ideals. And Adams then contrasted that with the dynamo, its impersonal, inhuman power, which he thought was a monument to the chaos and multiplicity that modernity had unleashed. So writing about this contrast beneath his usual veneer of sardonic world weariness that he always affected, Adams was plainly hoping that he could somehow reverse a process in which any traditional notion of common ideals seemed to be decaying, dying from a kind of entropy of belief. When friends would ask him about his politics, he would puckishly call himself a conservative Christian anarchist. To him, it was a private joke, because what he was saying, and which his correspondents understood, is he wanted to tear down the establishment to restore ideals that no longer seemed to exist. There is a second fundamental theme in Adams's work. It is his wonderment at the sheer scale of the new forces he sees coming into play. He actually played in various parlor games of calculating the vast exponential rate of increase in the physical energy, the commerce, the industry, just in his lifetime, since the 1830s. Then he would observe wittily the follies of essential incomprehension of the human beings who, while they thought they were riding those forces, were really more their creatures than their masters. Adams would have agreed completely with the later bitter comment of the French premier Georges Clemenceau, who commented that human beings are like apes who have stolen Jupiter's thunder. Adams tried to summarize some of these themes, the entropy of values, the match of human society against modern forces, in a letter he wrote to a scientist friend of his in 1905. He wrote to his friend that he didn't think it would need another century or half-century to tip thought upside down. Law, in that case, would disappear as theory or a priori principle and give place to force. Morality would become police. Explosives would reach cosmic violence. Disintegration would overcome integration. 1905. Adams was, of course, all too prescient. He died as one world war came to a close that had inspired many to sense, as Albert Schweitzer did, that the suicide of civilization is in progress, and the next landslide will very likely carry it away. And the next landslide almost did. Adams was really asking two essential questions. First, can the nations define and sustain a civilized world in this modern globalized era in some common way? And second, can human beings constructively master the unnatural and unprecedented forces they have put in motion? So when we think about the ideals to address these fundamental questions, we're really debating the goals of some kind of global civilization, or if you prefer, some kind of law-abiding world. Now, if you think then back to the question of how would an American government try to capture this in some sort of policy concept it could use to lead the world, let's reflect briefly on other big P policy concepts that the American government has used effectively and durably at other times in our history. The list is short but memorable. No entangling alliances. The heritage of George Washington's political testament to Americans. Or the Monroe Doctrine. Or the open door, which was devised in order to stop the carve-up of China in 1900 and keep the world open, just as it hoped to keep a door open, in that case to China. But the concept, of course, grew to have much larger meanings. Or in more recent times, a term like containment or deterrence. Notice about these terms, like containment or deterrence. These terms are not, neither Democrats nor Republicans can claim ownership exclusively of these terms. Both Democrats and Republicans supported these general directions, and then they argued heatedly about what they meant and about how to apply them. In other words, they shared a sense of common purpose within broad parameters, and then argued about what that would mean in practice. So they argued about what the big P policy should be. In 1990 and 1991, the United States and its European allies laid good foundations for what would in effect be a comprehensive post-war settlement. The elder President Bush used phrases like New World Order, but he and his colleagues never had a chance to add the words or complete the structures that would fill out the vision. In the early 1990s, President Clinton wrestled with this too. There was really a memorable account of this offered in a recent book by Bill Clinton's Deputy Secretary of State, Strobe Talbot. Talbot recounts a meeting in the Oval Office in September 1994. I don't know if you were there for this one, Jim. When Clinton pushed his advisors to see that, here I'm quoting Clinton, quote, "Our operative problem of the moment is that a bunch of smart people haven't been able to come up with a slogan for where we are and what we're doing and why and where it's going to take us that's better than where we've been." This is still Clinton talking. "There was the Cold War, which gave way to the New World Order Bush talked about, but now everyone's afraid that's going to fall apart. So, what's next, you guys?" Close quote. In Talbot's account, Al Gore was the one who jumped up to that challenge. And Gore said, "People now feel in their bones that there's something fundamentally different about the world in which we live. Palpably, ours is becoming a global civilization. There's a universal sense," this is still Gore talking, "that democracy is humankind's chosen form of political organization, and that the free market is humankind's chosen form of economic organization. Rousseau said the body politic is a moral being possessed of a will. We need to make the leap from nationhood to a sense of identity that is truly global, but that embodies Rousseau's point. The blueprint is there and Jefferson wrote it. Close quote. Talbot goes on to add that he had never seen Gore in quite this mode before. And he suspects neither had Clinton. Clinton actually internalized Gore's argument, didn't quarrel with it, but never felt that he'd solved the problem of how to express it. Talbot was jabbed about this a little bit by his friend, the Stanford provost Condi Rice, in 1997. Well, you haven't explained where you're going very well. And he went back and told Clinton about Condi's complaint. And Clinton's reaction, this is in 1997, was, quote, "She's wrong about us not having a sense of direction, but she's right about our doing a lousy job of explaining it," close quote. Well, Condi Rice would soon get her own chance to work on this problem. And I don't want to do a detailed recapitulation of the last 8 years of the Bush administration. What I do want to remark, though, is their experience illustrates a couple of successes and a couple of failures, and all of them are instructive. So I'm going to dwell for just a minute on these successes and failures. A couple of successes. First, the Bush approach, I think, solidified an emerging consensus that world politics has changed in a profound way, which emphasizes the rise of transnational issues, cutting across societies, instead of being defined principally by the divisions between states. So traditional rivalries of power blocks recede in importance, and there are unprecedented opportunities for cooperation among world powers. That sense, that depiction, I think, has solidified in the last 8 years. A second success was to reinforce an already emerging view that if the era is dominated by transnational concerns that are cutting across societies, well then, the nature of domestic governance is an appropriate core concern of international politics. That's a big idea. By the way, that vital stream, that domestic politics is a necessary subject of international politics, has several tributaries, if you reflect on it for a moment. Of course, the shock of 9/11 played a big role, because then there is a need to assert other political ideas against the extremist ideas that the assault represents. So out of that trauma, people necessarily began being forceful and assertive about different ideas of what Bush, in his most eloquent formulation of this, called the non-negotiable demands of human dignity, which actually was in January of 2002. But there are other streams that are important to note as well. For example, an emerging consensus that if you wanted to give a lot more foreign aid to the poorest people in the world, you had to look at their domestic governance to see if that aid could be usefully used. That's now actually a fairly broad consensus in the development community, and the Bush administration used that consensus to persuade Congress to double the amount of overseas development assistance the U.S. government would provide. But it's been part of a broader consensus that's not just about the United States at all. Third, if you notice, look at the accession negotiations for countries like China that have acceded to the World Trade Organization. Look at the issues on which they need to negotiate and reach agreement for WTO accession, or for accession negotiations to the European Union, for countries like Turkey or others in Eastern Europe. Or, for example, look at the kind of issues that come up for countries that want to join a bilateral free trade pact in the Western Hemisphere, whether that's in Central America or in the case of Mexico. And you'll see that in all the cases I've just listed, the issues are full of domestic policy issues. All kinds of issues of regulation, intellectual property, the way you're going to treat certain kinds of domestic products, obviously therefore saying you have to address your domestic governance in certain ways to reach this additional participation in the international community, like the WTO. Or to give you another example of the stream, there's obviously a fundamental overlap of domestic international policies if you look for just 5 minutes at energy issues, environmental issues, public health issues, all of them moving to the front of the international agenda in the early 21st century. So, those I regard as successes over the last 8 years. But there are also some failures that have to be noted. The first of them is having placed the issue of the character of governance and the values of governance front and center. The Bush administration tried to address that issue of values with a rhetoric of democratization that has not been effective. I'm just stating this as an empirical point. I'm not getting into a partisan argument. Why do I make this empirical point? Well, because no government doctrine ever enjoys a better reputation than the policy story that is taken to exemplify it. Containment had the Marshall Plan and NATO. Bush's freedom agenda has the occupation of Iraq. And actually, although Bush is right and others are right when they say that, heck, talking about democracy is something that Democrats have done too, that many presidents have done. And that's certainly right. The overemphasis on a freedom agenda and a democratization agenda to people who are suffering all kinds of wrenching social problems by stressing that solution again and again and again, it appears to sound as if you're trying to sell people a cure-all. And then the listeners hearing that feel like you're talking past some of the problems I'm really confronting. And therefore you don't really want to address those. And that undermines the credibility of your argument. And I must also say that the administration's studied indifference to moral issues in the treatment of enemy captives, especially during its first term, tore its credibility to talk to others about right and wrong. So the net result is that the last 8 years has not seen the successful effort to build a consensus on how to talk about appropriate values in domestic governance as an element of international politics. The second failure is that the administration has not succeeded in the last 8 years in solving the problem the Clinton administration did not solve. They have not effectively put forward a larger global framework for cooperation. It's true that the Bush administration, especially in the second term, has built solid coalitions on a number of important issues. But these are mainly regional issues or functional issues. The sense of what's the global framework has not really emerged. So that issue of what's going to build on the foundation of the post-war settlement of 90, 91, 92, in a way still therefore has not been addressed. Now, Britain's former Prime Minister Tony Blair has talked about a doctrine for international community, especially in a speech he gave in Chicago in 1999. And actually, France's new president, Nicolas Sarkozy, promised in January of this year to, quote, create a politics of civilization to establish France as the soul of the new Renaissance which the world needs, close quote. But notice the evocation of this idea of a politics of civilization. And Sarkozy specifically alludes to the work of an 87-year-old French philosopher named Edgar Morin. Morin, by the way, was a little befuddled at the fact that Sarkozy was picking him up in this way, because the people who'd been most of the greatest admirers of Morin's work were people in the New Left in Southern Europe and Latin America. So here's a politician of the French right who's now picking up this idea. So Morin's answer to this was he doesn't think President Sarkozy has grasped yet how radical an idea a politics of civilization would be. But, you know, it's actually possible that Sarkozy has grasped it, because he's asked two Nobel laureates, namely Joe Stiglitz and Amartya Sen, to devise an index to show, the way Sen describes it, that there is more to human progress than aggregate statistics of growth, close quote. So some interesting ferment is going on. China is struggling with this right now. Their party Congress just said that it's going to choose a path of peaceful development for China's relations with the world, but you can see a lot of arguments in China over the content of what that's really going to mean. So where are we now? Where we are now, I think, unfortunately, is that to a bewildering, confused world, the United States currently brings a bewildering, confusing melange of policy ideas. The country's politicians and officials talk about terror, democracy, proliferation, trade, the environment, growth, and dozens of other topics. They strike 100 notes, but there is no melody. Let's talk a little bit more about the ingredients of what a big P policy would need. There was a reason why terms like containment and deterrence worked so well. Of course, they weren't jargony terms that only an exclusive elite could understand. But they were ideas that were obviously relevant to concerns that a great many people shared. And in this day and age, there are two sets of trends and conditions that can meet this standard, that are taken seriously by peoples on every continent. Globalization is one. Self-determination is the other. I don't think there's any need to go through the significance of globalization in economics, politics, commerce, and culture. The current Director of National Intelligence simply calls it in testimony, quote, the defining characteristic of our age, close quote. Unprecedented forces are in motion. But as societies, I don't think we understand these new forces. And we're not sure our governments can master them. Just look at the daily news. We are in the midst of a global financial crisis that is driven, literally, by our inability to understand the assets upon which colossal bets have been placed. We experience astonishing velocity and strain in the use of energy. We can barely understand the unprecedented pressure humans are placing on the global environment. Pollsters recently asked citizens in half a dozen wealthy countries what they thought about globalization. These are citizens in countries that had done relatively well out of the process, and their attitudes about globalization were resoundingly negative. Except in Germany, the issue was not even close. In America, about 18% had a positive view of globalization. 48% were negative, the rest were unsure. In Britain, the negatives outnumbered the positives by more than 3 to 1. Why? On the surface, I think there may be fears about outsourcing or job insecurity, especially among less skilled workers that are hurt by the fact that global manufacturing is now a two-way street, with developing countries having some important competitive advantages. But my judgment is that such strong worries come from concerns that are wider and deeper, that come from fears that are very hard to articulate, that people feel they are being swept away by forces that are beyond their control, forces that are beyond their country's control, forces that are even beyond their understanding. And those fears, by the way, reinforce the other great global trend, which has long gone hand in hand with modernization and globalization, which is the pressure for more and more self-determination. 58 members of the UN in 1948, 100 more in 1988. And since the Cold War ended in Europe, it's taken off again. 35 new states will have been added just since then, once Kosovo joins the list. And that's just a partial indicator of self-determination. There are virtual and non-governmental communities. There are urban and regional entities that are also becoming global players, like, say, the municipal government of Shanghai, for example. What they're trying to do is assert political identities, a sense of who we are that is codified in some kind of political communal way. This point about communal identity is essential. You see, self-determination is a term that itself didn't even exist until the middle of the 19th century. It grows out of a search for identity in a modern world. You see, the older sources of identity were religious, or rooted to the land, or hierarchical, or related to clan or family. But now in the modern age, people displaced or with attenuated links to those old ties create what one social scientist has called imagined communities that provide that sense of collective belonging, that social kinship, that help against the threatening other. So when the current President Bush or Senator Obama remark on a worldwide demand for democracy or freedom, they see a form the phenomenon assumes, but they are not describing the phenomenon itself. Now, self-determination, like globalization, is a large historical force that cannot be categorized as either wholly good or wholly bad. But I'll offer you a pair of propositions about these phenomena. The first proposition: globalization is reversible. Frankly, I thought Kofi Annan, the former UN Secretary General, put this point best, actually about 10 years ago, when he acknowledged that globalization was a fact of life. But, this is Kofi, I believe we have underestimated its fragility. The problem is this: the spread of markets outpaces the ability of societies and their political systems to adjust to them, let alone to guide the course they take. History teaches us that such an imbalance between the economic, social, and political realms can never be sustained for very long. Close quote. And a couple of the best economic historians of the last 500 years, Ronald Finley and Kevin O'Rourke, recently concluded it would be foolish to simply assume that the remarkable progress achieved by globalization in the last few decades will be sustained into the future. Close quote. All right, so that's the first proposition. It might be reversible. The second proposition is about self-determination and the interaction. because I don't think a reversal in globalization will reverse the trend to self-determination. Instead, my proposition is that if there's a reversal of globalization or a palpable failure of global management, people will turn to self-help. And self-determination will take on forms and goals that will be more disintegrative and more toxic and violent. I want to introduce a third idea, because so far it sounds like I'm getting ready to advocate one world or some kind of new world government, and I'm not. And here's the interesting paradox I want to introduce, which is that you need to balance the vitality of both a global framework and the primary communities the framework actually should nurture and encourage. The most renowned scholar of world history in America probably is William McNeill at Chicago. McNeill actually has written a terrific book called About a Global Web, in which he argues that in the course of world history we evolved from little cell-like primary communities into interactions among all these primary communities of this global web. And then he asks at the end of the book how we're going to deal with, though, his heightened sense of insecurity about whether the global web can endure. He just isn't sure that all these flows of food, energy, meaning, hopes can really endure, because it's impossible to forge a common identity and moral purpose among 6 billion people. So what you actually need is, to borrow an IT metaphor, is something more like a distributed network, in which you create a global framework in which you actually nurture and foster even more vital, autonomous, primary communities that feel that they can find their own distinctive identities and pathways. This is actually a great insight that Amartya Sen, the economist and philosopher, has also had, when he made the argument that he's not arguing in favor of some global sense of belonging to be reflected in the working of a colossal world state. In fact, he wrote, global identity can begin to receive its due without eliminating our other loyalties. And McNeill, in parallel, coming to the same conclusion, says that actually the paradox is you have to fuse, and he doesn't use these exact words, globalization and self-determination together to create a global framework that nurtures self-determination in constructive and benign ways. That sounds like the reconciliation of opposites. And McNeill's argument, and here I am quoting, how to reconcile such opposites is the capital question for our time, and probably will be for a long time to come. Close quote. Now, there are a number of principles that you can imagine that you could come up with that would be principles for a global framework. I'll just briefly offer my set, and I'm not going to comment on them at length, but I'm just trying to be specific and articulate them. I'd say they would include respect for the identities of others, and the pluralism of identities, and that one person can actually have several different senses of identity. Methodist, engineer, tennis player, can all be in one person. Second, cooperative prosperity. Cooperative prosperity. Third, mutual security. States cannot secure themselves by making everyone else insecure. Fourth, stewardship of the planet. Fifth, limited government. Limited government. Now, by the way, my choice of the term limited government is quite deliberate. I didn't say democracy or freedom, because I want to talk about the objective result you seek and not the path by which you seek it. To give you an illustration, there are all kinds of ways you can limit the power of government and leave more space for human dignity and for human autonomy and human development. There's actually a neat debate going on, according to the newspapers, right now among intellectuals at China's Central Party School, which trains their leadership cadres about different ways they can limit government power working inside China's political discourse. And they're very careful about the words and language that they use, because it has to work in their political discourse. But the result they want really is more to limit the power of government, which then fosters a sense of pluralism in the society that then allows the kind of reconciliation of opposites that we've been talking about. Another aspect of this point, of how you balance the global framework and primary communities, is to first recognize the awesome power of global ideals. Civilization, by the way, is one of the few terms you can find that is genuinely universal. There are equivalent terms in Chinese and in Arabic, and it's had awesome power in the 19th century, 20th century, in the way it affects all kinds of peoples who try to mimic or imitate or strive towards some notion of what the common civilized ideal is. Yet can also be very dangerous, because it can turn into a sense of civilizing mission. And I was really struck by the wonderful line that Mark Twain had about this when he wrote about the civilizing mission in 1901. Twain wondering, well, quote, "Should we go on conferring our civilization upon the peoples that sit in darkness? Or shall we give those poor things a rest? Shall we bang right ahead in our old-time, loud, pious way and commit the new century to the game? Or shall we sober up and sit down and think it over first?" Close quote, 1901. Well, I think Twain is right. And so we should sober it up, sit down, and think it over. And I think, frankly, the way this works is it works precisely if you don't come in with a sense of civilizing mission, but more a sense of what you can accomplish and what others could aspire to accomplish as an ideal that others may seek to imitate on their own and in their own pathways. How then do we get there? How then do we get to this result? We need to recover a sense of common purpose and principles. We need, I will say, to reintroduce America to the world. If America and other fortunate nations converge behind such goals, a law-abiding world, global civilization, whatever you prefer, a benevolent empire or hegemony is no answer. Americans do not want the job, and even if they did, they are not strong enough to do it. Nor is any world government in prospect that can fill the bill. Returning to an older world of selfish powers balancing against each other is no solution either. It's a dangerous possibility, but it would do more to threaten civilization than to preserve it. So where do you go with this? I think you have to make, first of all, a strong positive argument in favor of an affirmative global ideal. You can't just let this drift, because in a situation of drift, the natural forces pull in the direction of selfish interests that don't see an articulated collective ideal. The collective ideal is half articulated, half formed, and the other forces may be too strong. Even in the best of times, the most high-minded governments naturally encompass an appropriate tug-of-war between narrow self-interests and the costs or sacrifices that will be required by some argument that involves longer-term or shared interests. The larger notions have a chance in that tug-of-war only if they are animated by ideals that are strong enough to really pull their end of the rope. If the ideals are weak and superficial, if the structures of great power cooperation and multilateral institutions are weak, then they may come apart in a storm. The counterweight to the world of zero-sum rivalry will vanish. That side of the rope in the tug-of-war will be dropped. All the forces will run towards the anarchy of all against all. When I was talking about this argument recently to a Harvard historian friend of mine named Neil Ferguson, he says, well, when you give this in a speech, what you have to have is some section in which you describe the horrors that would then ensue so that you can freeze their blood. And then I kind of worked through what are all the scenarios that I could offer you. Is this the scenario of India, China, Japan in a rivalry? Is this the scenario of food riots and unrest in dozens of countries that have the billions of poor people in the world? Is this a scenario of the waters inundating the eastern seaboard? And then I was reminded of a Ron Hansen short story in a collection that he has called Nebraska. And in this short story, a hitman is working through all the scenarios in which he in turn will finally be killed, because he knows that now the gang is out to get him. And he runs through these scenarios over and over again, and he works through 80 different scenarios of how this can happen, and finally, it always ends up the same way. No escape. And so finally, he just kills himself. Well, that's not really the solution I want to advocate. Look, though, at the candidates that are on offer right now to try to offer this kind of leadership. I will describe, I think there are 5 major candidates. First is, I would call it opportunistic globalism. That's kind of a little bit of what I think we have now. So the people who are profiting from globalism are for it. Big Pharma and their interest groups will lobby for an open economy to that extent. Microsoft will lobby for it, and others. And those who are being hurt by the global economy will lobby against it. And so you'll have opportunistic globalism. And as I've just argued a moment ago, I just don't think that's strong enough to pull the other end of the rope. Second approach is identity politics. Identity politics. So having argued that I don't think you can defend globalization just with the economic arguments, I'll now make the argument that you can't defend globalization by a vocabulary of identity politics. So if you say it's American civilization versus Muslim civilization, you're inviting identity politics, which of course is exactly the game Osama bin Laden hopes will play. And interestingly, the most important clash of civilizations is not between Muslim civilization and Western civilization. It's the clash going on inside their civilization. If you want empirical evidence, look at the history of Turkey over the last 12 months and what their debates are about. Or Pakistan. Or Indonesia. In Pakistan, for example, right now, because of this political turmoil, notice that the parties that have just gained power are parties that are avowedly secular, whatever their views about the United States. That's the kind of interesting struggle that's going on inside civilizations. So if we go into a vocabulary of identity politics, we elevate the xenophobes in every one of these societies to being the appropriate spokesman for what they represent. I don't think that's in our interest. Third concept is a war on terror. My view of this is that something like that may be necessary, it's just not sufficient. Necessary but not sufficient. It just doesn't answer enough mail. Think about the issues I've just been talking about. Fourth is the concept of advancing democracy, or to borrow another recent formulation, to stand for, seek, and secure a world of liberty under law, close quote, from a bipartisan group. I think those are good goals. But when you think about the complications that Americans in the world are sensing from globalization and self-determination, there again is some level at which that vocabulary again just doesn't seem to answer the mail. Not in those countries, and not for a lot of issues Americans confront. A fifth candidate is where people say we need to return to realism. Now, academics and pundits regularly pose a choice between realism and idealism. This is part of the Bush administration are a bunch of utopian idealists, and instead we need to return to realism. I believe this is a deeply false dichotomy. Yes, in the world of politicians, these are fancy ways of saying someone else is incompetent. Because they don't, as the Chinese would put it, seek truth from facts. And yes, in the world of theorists, there is an argument among different schools of thought that use artificial labels like these. But in the world where American policies are daily carried into practice by legislators, officials, and soldiers, the argument between realism and idealism is disconnected from reality. Ideals and value judgments, sometimes explicit but often implicit, are woven tightly into the fabric of every alternative policy that can be put on the table. Arguing whether American officials should favor realism or idealism is about as useful as arguing whether we might prefer children either with a mother's chromosomes or with a father's chromosomes. In life, all the children have both. So too often the American debate is reduced to a cartoon. Over here, there are the unilateral regime changers. And over there are the multilateral regime coddlers. These are straw creatures, stuffed puppets for those who want to be entertained by the American Punch and Judy show. So let me go into a little more detail then of if we pursued this kind of global framework for a law-abiding world, for a global civilization, what would such an agenda look like if you wanted to describe a policy agenda animated by those kinds of ideals? Well, I'm going to kind of dare to offer you some working illustrations of what such an agenda might look like. I think actually we're on the verge of an extraordinarily creative period in thinking about global policies. One former chief economist of the IMF said, we are seeing the seeds of a new paradigm. So here are my illustrations. The first of them is that we need to address the breakdown of essential public order in weak states and develop more effective ways of dealing with transnational crime. Of course, a civilized world should unite against violent extremists who have regional or global reach. The first duty of the president is to protect the country, and it's hard for him to get to any other duties until he thinks he's done that adequately. But Islamist terrorism, which is very important, and I've spent some time working on that problem, but that's just a part of a larger theme. The rise in transnational crime as a problem of public order around the world, usually a problem of public order in weak states, but also the absence of a global framework to deal with a transnational criminal phenomenon. I mean, look at the breakdown of public order now in significant parts of Central America. Look at Mexico, which Texans see a lot of. And a lot of Texans, though many Americans don't understand, but a lot of Texans do, that Mexico itself is very close to the brink of a strange new kind of civil war that defies easy categorization. Conventional ideas and capabilities for outside aid have not been a good fit. We need some fresh thinking, as NATO has been discovering so painfully in Afghanistan. What are the fundamental gaps here? Assistance in civilian governance and state building, where the institutions of developed countries have not yet adapted effectively to the requirements of this era in world politics. We also need some broader political will and capacity to fight these new sorts of small conflicts. In this new era, the most dangerous areas of the world are not marked by the concentrations of industrial might like coal and steel, as they were 100 years ago. In this new world, the most dangerous areas may be the wilderness areas of the world that lie on the frontier of civil order. Harvard professor Samantha Power actually put this very nicely. She said, when it comes to dealing with any of the threats, whether it's the rise of new powers, the rise of rogue nations, the rise of transnational jihadists, and so forth, it's the problem of the commons. It's that actually very few actors within the international system want to play in the commons, want to make sacrifices domestically, want to have difficult domestic conversations about committing forces to any kind of antidote to failing states. See, because there's not enough pull on the other side of the rope. And so it's hard to make the argument that it's worth the lives of young men and women. And finally, there's the absence of a firmer moral and legal foundation for common action in the way our country and its partners gather intelligence and handle captives. That's a framework that's going to have to be built up and strengthened in the coming years. Stronger coalitions can do a lot just in exchanging relevant information. The world does a better job tracking lost credit cards than it does tracking lost passports. Let me introduce a second illustration of a different agenda. How about we look at the agenda for the global economy to look beyond traditional issues of trade and exchange toward frameworks for globalized investment and globalized business operations. For nearly 200 years, the international economic system has been preoccupied with structures for trade and exchange among what they assumed were fundamentally national firms. So even the notion of multinational corporations in the 70s was a vision of fundamentally national firms with widespread foreign branches and operations. I will argue that in the last 25 years, we have really an entirely new world of international capital flows that have come out of the wreckage of the old Bretton Woods system, and that's grown to giant proportions. There is clearly the need for a public agenda that addresses transnational regulatory issues. And this is not an agenda for either right or the left, because I actually don't think it's in anyone's national interest to try to stand up on your own to transnational investors with just one country's ad hoc regulations. And we're in a situation where if you want more transparency and protection for your citizens, you're going to be disadvantaged in the competition to gain investment dollars. So there's a real case for transnational action, I think, from both the people who want investment and the people who might be interested in protection for the people who are the recipients of investments. But to give you another example, think about global business operations. You have genuinely global firms today. If you look at the operations of a firm like Siemens or Microsoft or many others, and they confront a blizzard of different laws and rules. So again, for the net benefit of all, a common framework for regulation can protect both vulnerable citizens and economic growth. This is not just the objectives of someone who's trying to find some ways to throw a loop around global business. The agenda I've just described is supported by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Why? It's because global business would rather have global regulatory cooperation to confronting the patchwork of investment rules, product standards, and competition policies, and many others they now have to sort out in order to conduct global business operations. You know, one of the great mistakes of the 1920s is that the economic leaders kept looking backwards, trying to rebuild an anachronistic system that had worked well in the past but was actually then part of the problem. I'm referring to the gold standard. We shouldn't repeat this mistake in a new form. The agenda for the world economy needs to look forward, not just backward. Third, we need to fashion a program of inclusive, sustainable globalization. Above all, for the 50 or so nations that World Bank researcher Paul Collier has described as the bottom billion. The inclusive, sustainable globalization phrase is one I borrowed from Bob Zelikow, the new president of the World Bank. By the way, I'm not trying to get in here and just offer my own agenda for global development. There are many, many issues already out there in the mix right now. What I'm noticing, though, is the synergy that arises from several different patchy global frameworks that are fraying and falling apart. For example, the global inability to fill the public order deficit that might give weak states a chance to take off. The security problems that plague us in one level are also, of course, the plagues for these countries. And then they build security institutions to cope with those problems that then, frankly, become the cancers eating away at their own societies. Or, for example, the global inability to bridge the gap that separates the poorest people from the otherwise available tools, knowledge, and resources that could transform their lives. I'm now on the board of the Global Development Program of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that's working at trying to address precisely this problem of how you connect those poor people with information, with cash money, with seeds that they could access if only they just had some kind of linkage that would connect them to things that otherwise would be available to them. Because they can't, those bridges just aren't there. Or for another illustration, there is a global inability now to combat trends that may limit and threaten the basic inputs the poorest people will need for any hopes of further development. Above all, I single out the inputs of energy and water. Energy and water. The rising costs right now for energy, however bad you think $110 a barrel oil is, it's killing the poor people in the world. It's much worse for them. What that does to their transport costs and to inputs like fertilizer, which are essential for any hopes for a new green revolution in Africa, are just vital. And then when you look at the interesting issues of the scarcity of water, and of course then that interacts with the climate change issue, which is also connected to the energy issues, you begin to see the synergy that a global framework has to comprehend. And a final example then, just under this global development point, is we really do now have a global inability to adjust world food production and markets for 21st century interdependence. I really think the world system for how we think globally about food production and marketing is deeply broken. And actually, again, Bob Zelikow last week in an address as president of the World Bank on the 4 priorities for economic statecraft for the world's poorest people, put number 1 on the list, a new deal in global food policy. Let me offer you a 4th illustration of what such a new agenda might look like. A stronger global agenda for the international management or elimination of increasingly available ultra-hazardous materials and technologies. It's the diffusion of ultra-hazardous materials that's really a distinctively 21st century phenomenon, as opposed to the industrial mass of weight and metal that was the concern of people who studied military issues 100 years ago. Think about biological and ecological techniques and technologies that are opening up new vistas for the alteration of human biology, the development of pathogens, even the deliberate modification of planetary ecology at what you will find is surprisingly low cost. From a world historical perspective, I'll simply note the issue of nuclear weapons as well. You know, the United States led the development of nuclear weapons because at the time we had a desperate desire to leverage advantages in technology and aerial bombardment against the large land armies of world-threatening enemies in World War II and the Cold War. If you think about that fundamental portrait, in the 21st century, both the moral and the practical context for the use of such weapons by developed states has just obviously profoundly changed and reversed. Because the greatest danger for the use of such ultra-hazardous weapons of terror would now be from those who wish to rend the fabric of existing civilized society anywhere. That's why I'm actually sympathetic to the agenda put forward by woolly-headed liberals like Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, and other Republicans and Democratic statesmen like former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry and others, who are calling to find some pathway towards the complete elimination of such weapons, which I think needs to be done through a concept of international management of ultra-hazardous technologies, not just placing faith in outlawing them and hoping that you can inspect it. Now for a fifth and final illustration of what such a global agenda might include. It's a framework in which you have a global framework for local choices about how different societies will reduce a global dangerous reliance on oil and dirty coal. If you'll notice what I've already commented on, these issues surface in a variety of different settings. But I will argue that world oil supply is moving toward a state of deep continuous crisis. I do not think that the high prices we're seeing now are going to be like the spike at the end of the 1970s that will then lead to the deep trough of the late 1980s. Why do I make that argument? It's because the basic dynamics of world oil production, I think, have changed. A lot of people believe that oil production is mainly controlled by big oil companies like ExxonMobil or Chevron. They're mistaken. In fact, 96% of the world's oil reserves are now controlled by national oil companies, including the state-controlled Russian and Chinese companies. The way these companies and the way these countries tend to expand oil production, I'll call it suboptimal. Suppliers tend to pay rents, as economists would put it, to authoritarian governments. They tend to underinvest in expanding production, and they tend to manipulate supply for political reasons. So on current trends, you're going to have a situation of sustained, extremely tight supply that then create all kinds of rigidities and vulnerabilities to shocks that could quickly tip you over into various serious global economic recession, aside from all kinds of sectoral issues of the kind we've already been talking about, in addition to the trends that may threaten to do terrible damage to the planet itself. And all the major proposals for dealing with the energy environment dilemmas, like climate change, rest on a global framework that has to have wide participation, with China at the core. And all of the most attractive frameworks are simply about frameworks for creating some parameters in which these countries will then make local choices. And that's the only thing that will sell for countries like China and India. So, what I've tried to do today, and you've been very patient with me, is by bringing these sort of hopes for a law-abiding world, for a global civilization, that I think actually are in many of your minds, and many of these ideas are not original at all. But by trying to pull them together in this way, I'm struggling with ways, as part of this project I'm involved in, of trying to help develop some concept that can form a rallying point for a lot of people, and that a lot of people might find something interesting that they can work with and improve upon. The challenges we face are challenges that go with modern globalized life. And I keep coming back to those questions that Henry Adams had in mind as he stood there at the Paris Exposition of 1900. And he was gazing up at the giant dynamo on the one hand, and reflecting on the force represented by the cathedral on the other. And those questions: can we preserve some notion of a common ideal for a global civilization? Can we stay ahead of the forces we have set in motion? One chapter of world history ended nearly 20 years ago. Another is beginning. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Phil, for a very broad-ranging and provocative exposition to come up with a big P, which I think so many of us have been struggling with for a long time, and I know there'll be a lot of questions. Let me just ask you, or push you a little bit on one dimension. You talked at a number of places about the need for multilateral structures to support the global ideal that you talked about, the need to broaden political will and capacity to deal with the problem of broader public order, citing Samantha on the problem of the commons. I guess I'd like to hear a little more, and maybe I'm not just fully appreciating your argument about how do we overcome that? I mean, these again, the things that you've articulated are principles that it would produce positive sum results. But the fact is we have always had this problem of transitioning from this suboptimal state to a higher production function, a more optimal state. And the question is that getting from here to there problem. I'll push you particularly on Afghanistan, okay, because there you have a situation, unlike others, where there is a existing multilateral structure that was precisely designed to overcome these collective action problems, which is NATO. That is, it's more than just trying to impress individual countries in their individual capacity to come together. The theory was that by having the structure, we'd be in a better position to produce collective action to deal with the problems of interest. And maybe we've made some progress in the last week or two. I'll remain to be convinced. We certainly have struggled with this. So the question is, and I'm maybe just asking you to get a little bit more operational in how you talk about this, is to do what you've talked about and to address these things, we do need to develop these capacities and to deal with the collective action problem. And so how would you get started on a problem like Afghanistan? Is NATO insufficient? Are there other structures? What kinds of approaches could get us to deal with the first of these many challenges that you've identified?
I'll answer this two ways. First of all, I really think you need a countervailing ideal that's better than the one we've got. I don't think that you rally the world to Afghanistan by saying it's part of America's war on terror, because that's not a phrase and an ideal that a lot of the world has actually internalized as their own. There's no sense of common ownership there, or a sense that we're all stakeholders in the way you've defined the objective here. So there's a sense of obligation, but not really a sense of we really deeply intellectually agree on the stakes in a lot of those countries. And in the particular case of Afghanistan, you are relying on a situation in which Europe is going through a transition in which many European governments actually no longer believe in the use of force for almost any purpose whatever, for various historic and social reasons. So for a lot of those reasons, you need to develop a countervailing ideal. I think we've taken too long in doing that, and it's going to take time to do it. But I want to stress the significance of that, because if you look back on the problem of the early 30s, it's basically the failure and disintegration of the rather weak countervailing ideal that was offered. And so essentially you had some very strong, purposeful, steely ideals against which there really was nothing except a pallid counter-argument. And that remained true actually in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War until basically a sense partly gelled by what people were against, but also an increasing common sense of what they were for began to come together, not from one person, but from a lot of different streams of intellectual life that began to share a lot of common ideals and common writings. And then slowly that begins to take on a mass of its own and a power of its own. That turned out to be formidable. There are other examples of basically no countervailing ideal in the 1890s against the rush of imperialism and the beliefs in social Darwinism. And then finally you interpose one through the soft power of the United States, rather weakly. It wasn't powerful, but it was just enough kind of to deflect the shot, kind of hit the elbow and deflect the shot at a key moment, and then it acquired a little more force as time went on. So that I do think there is a need to really develop a countervailing ideal, and in some ways you could make an argument it would be best if it didn't come from the United States originally. It would almost be best if it came from somewhere else and the United States agreed and picked it up. And actually, if you could even suggest to some people, there are ways that you could think about that problem. But I don't want to completely dodge the specific question about Afghanistan. Because I think what we've seen here in Afghanistan is a situation of extreme trial and error. I do want to note something we have on our side in Afghanistan, which is I've been to Afghanistan a number of times, but I haven't been recently. I haven't been in a couple of years now. And so my information may be stale. But from what I knew then and what I can tell from the papers, I don't see any sign that most Afghans really wish the Taliban was running the country. They're not popular. Mainly they rule areas in which people are scared to death of. And then they have some zealot follow, but actually the demographic base of a lot of their support keeps seeming to come from outside of Afghanistan, nearby. But that's interesting. That's a big thing that they have on their side, is most people more or less want to have local autonomy above all, with their local way of life, but they kind of like what they have now in Kabul better than the Taliban, although they're very annoyed with Kabul in lots of ways. So that's something you can build on. And then the problem, though, is to make either local government or the Afghan government meaningful as an alternative to the Taliban. And we're right now in a period of restless experimentation about different ways to try to do that. And I don't think kind of a clear, viable model has emerged yet out of that. But I'm hopeful that that some interesting ideas are emerging. That as people go around the country, they're seeing examples of communities where you've actually helped local governments kind of defend themselves better against the Taliban without kind of interposing central government police who don't want to fight and just want to smoke their pipes instead of showing up for their watch on guard duty.
Right here.
I find it very hard to imagine much progress being made on your agenda unless and until the seemingly endless conflict in Iraq ends. And I wonder whether you, given your involvement with it, see any way of movement in that direction that wouldn't compromise your agenda. Because I don't hear anything coming out of Washington at this point that sounds at all promising. Certainly this week, testimony before Congress is extremely dispiriting in that regard, I think.
Yes, I think my concern about the testimony before Congress this week, and my views on the Iraq issue since I left government, are published. I have a very tiny little essay in a recent issue of a journal called The American Interest, in which I and about 9 other people offered our 1,500 words worth of what we thought. And what I said then, and what I still believe to be true, is that we've stabilized the patient somewhat in Iraq. We haven't stabilized the patient in Washington, as we still have not found any kind of basis for a truly bipartisan consensus that signals either to Americans or Iraqis that the Americans have worked out how we're going to relate to Iraq in a sustainable way. And I think both of those things are important. And further, that I think you need an affirmative strategy for what it is we're trying to do in Iraq and how we intend to do it. That's more than stabilizing the patient, which is, I think, where a lot of the debate is right now. And my concern is, although the president is saying we're going to continue to stabilize the patient and hope the patient gets better, I think that they need to say, I wish they would say more than that about where they think this is going. Now, then the next president is going to decide how we're going to relate to that. And there's going to be a national debate about that. And your views might disagree from mine as to how that debate should be resolved. I've said in print what I think America's interests are in this place, but I basically said this is a country undergoing a revolution. It's an important country. We can't predict the outcome of their revolution, and they will decide. The revolution is still underway. We care about how that revolution turns out, and so we need to relate to that in some way to protect certain interests we have in how it turns out. And then we need to think of some way in which we relate to that sufficiently. And mainly my concern even when I was in government, was that most authority in Iraq is local and decentralized. And so whatever your approach is, it has to be decentralized and diversified and able to handle a lot of different political outcomes in Iraq, because the Iraqis are going to decide what those outcomes are going to be, and then we need to adapt to that. But I'll tell you that both in Iraq and in the region around, you'll hear lots of people who want us to leave, and you'll hear lots of people who want us to stay, and they're often the very same people. And sometimes you'll hear those two different views at different times of the same day, because there's this deep ambivalence. If the Americans leave in the wrong way, that sends all kinds of signals to the world and to the region about the fact that the Americans basically decided this was too hard and they were going to shrug this off. And you can argue that there is a coherent, significant argument, plausible argument that says, frankly, the easiest way out of this problem is just to take the loss and write it down, and just take the hit. I'm not yet persuaded that that's the optimal answer, but I know that some people are. On the other hand, I think that those who want to make a case for sustaining the engagement in Iraq and with this country in turmoil for some years to come need to do a better job of articulating what our interests are and make it clear the centrality that Iraqis will have to play, and that what we do will be related to the choices they make in community after community in that country.
Roger Lewis. I thought this was a very engaging agenda, and I'm quite taken with the argument that self-determination might be channeled in positive directions, yet you mentioned only in passing the place where this is most conspicuous, the United Nations. Is, by implication, the United Nations a burned-out case?
Well, I think, frankly, there's a great deal of consensus among everybody who's worked with the United Nations and has studied it with care. That consensus is that some parts of it work reasonably well and do important things, and some parts of it don't work well at all and are unfortunate, and are sources of great friction and quarrel, and the amount of effort and time you put into them is not recompensed by the output on the other end. And so you have things that you like and things you don't like, and you find and most people find the institution full of friction and very hard to work in. Yet they value it for lots of obvious reasons. And then amid that spectrum, you'll then find some Americans for whom the negative feelings have become so overwhelming that they can almost see nothing else. And there is even, a sense of, well, let's just abandon the United Nations and set up some other alternative institution. I see this from Republicans, but actually I also see this from Democrats. And both of them have different kinds of institutional tinkering that they propose. And my concern of that is some of these ideas look great on paper, but if you then analyze the prospects of getting anybody else in the world to go along with them, it's kind of bleak. Because most of the world, including most of our democratic developed allies, are still more or less content with the net bargains the United Nations represents. And so I think you basically have to make it do. But you notice that when I presented this agenda, one thing that's different from a lot of the ways in which people write this up is I didn't say a word about institutional reinvention and process. The agenda was all about substance. It was all about what it is you're trying to do. See, I have this old-fashioned view that form should follow function. And that if you will map out what it is you're trying to do, then you should look around and figure out what existing institutions or adaptations of institutions you need in order to accomplish those substantive objectives and perform those tasks. It's an extremely easy temptation, and it's the default approach of many of my colleagues in the State Department to approach all these questions by starting with the issues of institutional reinvention. But people love to do that. And by the way, down that road, I think, lies all kinds of division and conflict that will actually make your problems worse and will make it harder to then get at common work on substantive tasks. In part because it's so tempting to get lost in those issues, and in part because you'll create new frictions and embitterment by working on them. And having just gone through the arguments over how to expand the UN Security Council and the intense feelings that created between China and Japan, and also with India lurking on the margins, I can attest to that, how that issue then tended to drown out everything else. And meanwhile, all the time you were spending on that was time you weren't spending actually talking about any substantive task.
First, Philip, I want to thank you for a characteristically broad and brilliant synthesis, making me nostalgic for our days back together in Virginia when I got treated for this more often. It was truly, my mind's just swimming. I want to focus my comments on your sort of interpretation of modern history, the 1890 to 1950 period, and how much we can learn from that and how applicable it is. I think, and there's sort of three questions I have. The first would be, is what is happening today, how similar is it to what happened in the 1890 early part of the 20th century. And I sort of was writing up a list of similarities and differences. And I think it's important, I think as you kind of spin this out, it's important to sort of think through the similarities and differences. You can make an argument, similar demographic pressures, right? The late 19th, early 20th century. The real story is largely a demographic story, and there's similar demographic stories going on now, for instance, that's similar. Second, massive movements of people, both internally and externally, an extraordinary problem. A second or third thing, the shock to traditional societies that's caused by economic volatility and technological transformation. So right off the bat, I can see these similarities. What's the difference? The difference in the early part of the 20th century, as far as I can tell, was there was a great fear over competition for resources, a specific resource, and that was land, right? And so there was this terrible concern that if you're in Germany and you see this great growth, you're worried about whether you're going to be able to feed your people. You look around you, you see potentially hostile populations, the same sort of thing going on in Japan as you look at China. And that's a story where economics and demographics drives a particular nightmarish form of geopolitical competition that ends up in World War I and World War II. Well, that's where the part of the story seems to break down for me, because clearly this is not an issue. You're absolutely right that our food distribution and food economic system is broken, but there's the concerns about mass starvation or concerns about needing land as a resource to do this are no longer there. So that would argue for a disappearance of traditional geopolitics, and the question on that part comes, well, will your nightmare scenario, first of all, are all these characteristics sort of similar? Is the nightmare scenario competition of other resources like water and oil, or is it something different? Because without that fourth component, the geopolitical competition, I can't picture anything remotely as scary as the first part of the 20th century. So I want to hear, because this is very Neil Ferguson-esque. I mean, I want to hear why we're going to see something as bad. The second thing is, you talked about civilizational policy, and that makes me very, very nervous, because policy as an instrument, governments are very bad at doing cultural policy. Right? Policy is a very limited tool for shifting cultures. I can't even begin to imagine how problematic it is to think about civilizational policies. And in fact, I wonder if the comparison to things like containment, the open door, are correct. When I think of those, they're grand strategies. You identify a threat and you match resources. There is, of course, the rhetoric of identity behind it, but I wonder if civilization is very attractive, but if you go with civilization, then policy is the last place I go, because policies are extraordinarily weak in the face of shifting or changing civilization. The third comment, the third question I'd ask about is, I was puzzled by the limited state response. And I wish you could sort of, and this is kind of building what Jim said, but the response to this first crisis was the opposite, right? It was the New Deal. It was government intervening to manage volatility. It was the Bretton Woods institutions of the UN. People said, we will sacrifice some element of macroeconomic growth, some element of freedom, in order to get stability. So the answer was a strong, robust governmental response. Now, that may not be possible, but it would seem to be people's first inclination. When you think of anti-globalization responses, the first place they usually go to is the government to seek redress, to sort of smooth out these edges. So I'd be interested in hearing why you suggest limited government is feasible and the correct response.
Okay. On the first question, I'm actually going to use a Gordian knot approach, because rather than get into a detailed argument about the likenesses and differences of the early 20th century, in a way I don't have to shoulder that burden, because Ernie May and I and Dick Neustadt used to teach about reasoning from history. And we actually used to warn our students all the time against reasoning from analogies. And the argument we always made to them, just put very simply, is you use the past to suggest questions, not to find the answers. And so I think by talking about the past, I deliberately tried to use it because I thought that it suggested certain kinds of characteristic questions. But I think the answers will have a very much of a novelty of their own. I'm not sure that the crises of the 21st century will replicate or look like the crises of the 20th century. And frankly, I don't know. I'm not smart enough to be able to predict what form those crises will take. But if you were asked to kind of rate various risks, and then you were asked to assign significance to the downside risks and scale them along all the different issues I discussed, I think you'd find a pretty compelling argument for some kind of strong hedging strategies. On the second issue, though, of whether or not a countervailing ideal will fail because it's inevitably civilizational and then won't turn into something that's concrete enough in governmental terms, I do think you need watchwords for a grand strategy. The watchwords for a grand strategy only take you so far. They basically point you in a general direction, and then there will be huge arguments over the specifics of the route in that general direction. But that's really all I'm asking for, is a much stronger and more compelling vocabulary in arguing for a general direction than the one I see now, which is opportunistic and serendipitous and feels like it's drifting to me, and feels relatively weak. And my sense from history is that's not strong enough. And so mostly what I find in the virtues of these things in the past, and the open door is a very good example of this. The open door really is a soft power move all the way. In fact, at the time it was exerted, there was no hard power to back it up. And so it ends up being a soft power move in which the Americans then have to retreat, and they rely on a combination of American soft power and Japanese hard power to achieve the immediate objective in East Asia. But the concept kind of had a durable appeal that sort of hung on, and then began to kind of, like a virus, infect the whole discourse about the future of East Asia in some really interesting and important ways. You didn't mass a lot of military forces behind it, yet in some sense, it's really a key reason why Pearl Harbor got attacked and we found ourselves in World War II. So these ideals, I think, still really matter, even though their translation into government policies will remain really challenging. But on the third and final point, which is whether or not inevitably when you raise crises like this, you're just going to have to rely more and more on state action, and how that runs against the counsel in favor of a limited government. This is, of course, precisely the issue of the 1930s, in which the people of the 1930s experiencing that world crisis, frankly, liberalism just looked too weak. So most of the really activist intellectuals of the time tended to find themselves drifting towards stronger and more vigorous ideologies of either the right or the left. Because classical liberalism of limited government just seemed pale and timid by comparison, almost metaphorically. And so then I feel like you need to make an argument of the assertion of vigor behind these principles. And actually, I think the last 50 to 60 years offer some testament to the possibilities of putting some vigor behind arguments that nonetheless have limited space for government at their ideological root. And so I haven't yet given up on the fact that you don't have to resort to statist solutions in order to overcome mass crises. But your point has real force, because if global management fails and people have recourse to self-help in a desperate world, they will resort to statist solutions. And a lot of the things that you'd be most concerned about in those developments, and autarkic understandings of how the world should be organized, and we're not going to like that world, I think.
I'll take one more because we're running over time right here in the corner. Thank you. Yeah. Oh, no, sorry, the gentleman behind you.
You right here?
Yeah, sorry.
I guess I gathered from your speech that the war on terror is not going to be enough to accomplish the goals that you set out by itself. So something maybe I propose is just dropping this idea of the global war on terror completely. I don't know if you're aware of this, but there was a Zogby poll on public opinion with regards to 9/11, and if you look at the numbers underneath the poll, underneath just big numbers, amongst the people that are 30 years of age or under, something like 80% of them believe that 9/11 was not Muslim terrorists, that it was actually an inside job. So as this generation grows older and starts to take over the government, starts to write the history books, I mean, that fact is just going to come out. It's just going to be generally accepted knowledge. And I'm wondering if there might be a benefit to just going ahead and dropping the facade right now, so we can, get out of the war in Iraq, get out of Afghanistan and just start really attacking the global problems like the food shortage, the food issue, the oil issue, and the water, and whether you think that might be beneficial.
Well, without getting into popular beliefs and fads and how they change over time, it's an interesting conversation. And sometimes 80% of people have believed something, and then a few years later they believe something different, including all kinds of things about the shape and nature of the world and all the physical forces in it. But the point about the war on terror is a serious point. And the war on terror is a double-edged metaphor. It's very powerful in one sense, but it cuts the other way because it makes people think the United States is involved in a certain kind of agenda in a war that they didn't buy into, and so on. So that's problematical. On the other hand, what we have right now, in some respects, this war is not a metaphor. There are concrete armed conflicts going on. There's the Iraq issue, which people are already debating on, and on which the issues are well known. There's a conflict in Afghanistan that also has a significant transnational element. It's not just an Afghan civil war. It isn't even primarily an Afghan civil war. There are other elements going on in that. There are conflicts going on that are coming to the point of armed conflict that involve the United States and partner countries in places like the southern Philippines, in other parts of Southeast Asia, in East Africa, and other areas that actually are under the realm of armed conflict and around the world. So the United States is going to need, and its allies, need to find some common vocabulary to use in talking about that. There's a reality that a lot of these countries are going to want to do something to head off the threat of violent Islamist extremism. Just like 100 years ago, they wanted to do something to head off what they thought was the great reign of terror of their age, which was the global war against anarchism, which seized the public imagination grippingly 100 years ago. A movement that had killed 6 heads of state around the world, including a president of the United States, that seemed to be amorphous but inspired by distant, charming-looking ideologues with names like Kropotkin and Bakunin. But we don't remember that age now for the significance of the war on anarchism. We tend now to think of anarchism as having been a precursor and symptom of other things that were more important. In the short term, therefore, what I think we need to do is we need to see the conflict against violent Islamist extremism as a coalition effort, which is exactly what it is. Well, if you're going to wage a coalition conflict, the key members of your coalition need to agree on what to call that conflict, and they need to agree on the basic rules of engagement for that conflict. And we on our side then need to define that in terms that will at least meet our partners halfway, to give them a chance of developing a coalition approach, which in the long run I think is going to be more durable if you want to strengthen a global framework of cooperation.
Excellent. A very fine note. And thank you. I know there were more questions, but you've all been very patient, and I appreciate your coming. So once again, thanks to Phil Zelikow.
Thank you.